One of the biggest reasons entrepreneurs quit isn't lack of money, it's lack of support. 5 years ago, David sat at his small kitchen table, staring at a notebook filled with sketches, business plans, and ideas. His heart raced with excitement. After months of research, he finally had a vision he believed could change his life. But there was one person whose support mattered more than anyone else's. His wife, Rachel. "Take a look at this," David said, sliding the notebook across the table. Rachel glanced at the pages for less than 10 seconds before letting out a laugh. "You've got to be kidding." David forced a smile. "What do you mean? You seriously think this is going to become a real business?" she asked. "David, be realistic." The words hit harder than she realized. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking her to quit her job. He was simply asking her to believe in him. Instead, she shook her head and pushed the notebook back toward him. "People like us don't become entrepreneurs," she said. "Just keep your stable job and stop chasing fantasies." That night, David barely slept. Part of him wanted to give up. After all, Rachel wasn't just anyone. She was his wife, the person who knew him better than anyone else. If she didn't believe in him, maybe she was right. But something deep inside refused to let go. The next morning, while the rest of the city was still asleep, David woke up before sunrise. He opened the notebook again. Then, he got to work. Before his day job, he studied business strategies. During lunch breaks, he researched competitors. Late at night, while Rachel watched television, he worked on building his idea one small step at a time. The progress was slow, painfully slow. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And every time Rachel saw him working, she had something to say. "Still wasting your time? How much money have you made so far? When are you finally going to grow up?" David rarely answered. Not because the comments didn't hurt, but because he was beginning to understand something important. Sometimes the people closest to you can't see the future you're trying to build. And sometimes the only person who can believe in your dream is you. What David didn't know was that his quiet determination was about to lead him down a path neither of them could have imagined. And one day, the woman who laughed at his dream would be forced to confront a truth she never saw coming. Many entrepreneurs quit within the first few years, not because their ideas fail, but because they lose confidence along the way. One of the biggest causes is constant criticism from people close to them. For David, that criticism wasn't coming from strangers. It was coming from the person he loved most. As the months passed, Rachel's attitude toward David's business dream only got worse. At first, her comments seemed harmless. Little jokes, small remarks, the kind of things people say without thinking. But over time, those comments became sharper, more personal, more painful. Every morning, David woke up early to work on his startup before heading to his regular job. Every evening he came home exhausted, only to spend another few hours researching, planning, and building. Rachel watched it all, and she never missed an opportunity to remind him how foolish she thought it was. One night, David was reviewing customer feedback on his laptop when Rachel walked into the room. "Still pretending you're a businessman?" she asked with a smirk. David looked up but said nothing. "What happened today?" she continued. "Did your imaginary company finally make $1?" Rachel laughed at her own joke. David forced a smile and returned to his work. But inside, the words stung. The truth was that progress had been slow, very slow. His business wasn't making much money yet. Most people would have given up. Sometimes David wondered if he should too. But every time doubt entered his mind, something pushed him forward. A belief that there had to be more waiting for him. A belief that success often comes after years of struggle. Unfortunately, Rachel didn't share that belief. As her own career advanced, her confidence grew. So did her arrogance. She began comparing David to other men. Successful men, wealthy men, men who already had the things David was still working toward. At dinner, she would casually mention a co-worker's husband who had bought a luxury car. At family gatherings, she would praise entrepreneurs who had already made millions. The message was always the same. Why couldn't David be more like them? The worst part wasn't the criticism. It was the disappointment behind it. David could see it in her eyes. Rachel no longer viewed him as someone with potential. She viewed him as someone who had already failed. Yet every insult only strengthened his determination. While Rachel focused on what he hadn't accomplished, David focused on what he was becoming. What she didn't know was that every late night, every sacrifice, and every setback was teaching him lessons that no classroom ever could. And soon, life was about to give Rachel a reason to regret every word she had spoken. Because while she saw a dreamer chasing impossible goals, David was quietly building something much bigger than she could imagine. Rachel's promotion was supposed to be a happy moment. At least, that's what David thought. After years of hard work, she had finally been promoted to a senior management position at one of the fastest-growing companies in the city. The salary was higher. The benefits were better. And for the first time, Rachel had real authority inside the company. David was genuinely proud of her. When she received the news, he surprised her with flowers and her favorite dinner. "You earned this," he said with a smile. Rachel thanked him. But something was different. At first, the change was small, almost impossible to notice. She started spending more time talking about her job, more time talking about company politics, more time talking about important executives she worked with. Every conversation seemed to come back to one thing: her success. David didn't mind. He understood how much the promotion meant to her. But as the weeks passed, her confidence slowly turned into something else. Something harder. Something colder. One evening, Rachel came home from work looking unusually excited. "You should have seen today's meeting," she said. "The executives loved my presentation." "That's great," David replied. Rachel smiled proudly. "Honestly, most people in that room couldn't keep up with me." David laughed. "Sounds like you're becoming the boss." "I'm already more successful than most of them," Rachel said. David noticed the comment but chose not to respond. Over the next few months, Rachel's attitude continued to change. She began dressing differently, speaking differently, even carrying herself differently. She no longer talked about teamwork. She talked about rankings, status, power, and money. The more successful she became, the less respect she seemed to have for people she viewed as falling behind. Unfortunately, David was one of those people. Whenever relatives asked about his business, Rachel would answer before he could. "He's still working on it," she would say. The word "still" always carried a hidden meaning. Still trying, still struggling, still failing. One night, after attending a company event, Rachel sat down across from David. "You know what I realized today?" she asked. "What?" "The people who succeed in life stop dreaming and start producing results." David felt the sting immediately. Rachel wasn't talking about business in general. She was talking about him. But instead of arguing, David simply nodded. Because while Rachel was becoming more focused on appearances, David was becoming more focused on growth. He was learning lessons most people never learn. Patience, discipline, persistence. The kind of lessons that don't show up on a paycheck right away. What Rachel couldn't see was that David's business was quietly beginning to gain traction. Small wins were starting to appear. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, but enough to prove he was moving in the right direction. And while Rachel was celebrating her promotion, a much bigger opportunity was slowly making its way toward David. An opportunity that would eventually change both of their lives forever. For many people, being humiliated in front of others is one of the most painful experiences they can face. David was about to learn that lesson firsthand. It happened during Rachel's father's birthday celebration. The entire family was there. Brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles. The house was full of laughter, conversation, and music. At first, everything seemed normal. David greeted relatives, helped carry food, and joined family discussions. For a few hours, he almost forgot about the tension that had slowly grown between him and Rachel. Then the conversation shifted. As often happens at family gatherings, someone asked about work. Rachel's cousin smiled. "So, Rachel, how's the promotion going?" Rachel immediately lit up. She spent several minutes describing her new responsibilities, her growing team, and the executives she worked with. The family listened with admiration. David was happy for her. But then someone turned toward him. "What about you, David?" an uncle asked. "How's the business coming along?" The room became quiet. David smiled politely. "It's moving forward," he said. "Slowly, but we're making progress." Before he could say anything else, Rachel laughed. Not a small laugh, not a playful laugh, a loud laugh. The kind that makes everyone stop and look. David felt his stomach tighten. Rachel shook her head. "Progress?" she said. "You make it sound bigger than it is." Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. David tried to remain calm. Rachel continued. "He's been working on that business for years." More laughter followed. "But hey," she added sarcastically, "maybe one day he'll finally make his first million." A few family members chuckled nervously. Others looked down at their plates. No one knew what to say. David felt every eye in the room turn toward him. The humiliation burned. Not because strangers were laughing. Because his wife was leading the laughter. The person who should have defended him, supported him, believed in him. Instead, she was turning him into the evening's joke. For a moment, David considered responding. He could have argued. He could have defended himself. He could have pointed out all the sacrifices he had made. But he didn't. Instead, he simply smiled. Then, he changed the subject. The party continued. But something inside David had changed. On the drive home, Rachel acted as if nothing unusual had happened. She chatted about work. We talked about future promotions. Discussed upcoming company events. David barely spoke. Not because he was angry. Because he was thinking. Thinking about the difference between encouragement and criticism. Thinking about the kind of partner he thought he had married. And thinking about how much longer he could ignore what was happening. That night, long after Rachel had fallen asleep, David sat alone in his office. The silence felt heavy. But for the first time in years, he stopped asking himself whether Rachel believed in him. Instead, he asked a different question. What if her approval no longer mattered? The answer to that question would change everything. And soon, David would discover a truth that would push him toward the biggest decision of his life. A few weeks had passed since Rachel publicly humiliated him at her father's birthday party. The memory still lingered. Every laugh, every awkward silence, every look from relatives who didn't know what to say. Yet David chose not to bring it up. He buried the hurt and focused on his work. As usual, Rachel threw herself into her career. Her promotion had become the center of her world. Every conversation seemed to revolve around her company, her achievements, and the executives she interacted with. The more successful she became, the less patience she seemed to have for David's entrepreneurial journey. Then came the night that changed everything. Rachel invited several co-workers to their home for dinner. David greeted them politely before excusing himself to his office. He had deadlines to meet and clients to contact. Business was finally showing signs of life, though Rachel had no interest in hearing about it. A few hours later, David realized he had left his phone charging in the living room. As he walked down the hallway, he heard laughter coming from the dining area. At first, he paid little attention. Then he heard his name. His footsteps stopped. Rachel was speaking. Honestly, I don't know how he keeps convincing himself that business is going to work." The table erupted with laughter. David froze. One of her coworkers asked, "How long has he been trying?" Rachel shook her head. "Too long." More laughter followed. David stood silently in the hallway, hoping the conversation would move on. Instead, it got worse. One woman smiled and asked, "So why do you stay with him?" Rachel laughed again. Then she said something that hit harder than anything before. "Sometimes I wonder how different my life would be if I had married someone more successful." The room exploded with laughter. David felt as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. For years he had endured criticism. For years he had ignored the insults. But hearing those words spoken so casually changed everything. This wasn't frustration. This wasn't a temporary disappointment. This was how Rachel truly saw him. As a burden. As an embarrassment. As a mistake. Without making a sound, David turned around and walked back to his office. He closed the door behind him and sat alone in the darkness. Minutes passed. Then an hour. His mind replayed every moment from the past 5 years. The mocking comments. The public humiliation. The endless comparisons. For the first time, he stopped asking himself how to win Rachel's respect. Instead, he asked a different question. What if her opinion no longer mattered? The answer came with surprising clarity. He didn't need permission to pursue his dream. He didn't need validation to continue. And he certainly didn't need someone else's belief to define his future. When David finally stood up that night, something inside him had changed. The hurt was still there, but so was a new determination. Rachel thought she had broken his confidence. She had no idea she had just created the most focused version of David the world had ever seen. And very soon an opportunity would appear that neither of them saw coming. The next morning, David woke up before sunrise. For years he had started his days carrying a heavy burden. The burden of proving himself. Proving his dream was worth chasing. Proving that he wasn't the failure Rachel believed him to be. But something felt different now. The pain from the night before hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt sharper. Yet beneath that pain was a strange sense of peace. The truth was finally clear. Rachel wasn't waiting for him to succeed. She had already made up her mind about who he was, and for the first time, David stopped trying to change it. He sat quietly at his desk with a cup of coffee and opened his notebook. The same notebook Rachel had laughed at years ago. The same notebook that held hundreds of ideas, plans, mistakes, and lessons. As he flipped through the pages, he realized how much he had grown. The man who had started this journey was different from the man sitting there now. Back then, he wanted quick success. Now he understood patience. Back then, he feared failure. Now he respected the lessons it taught. Back then, he needed approval. Now he only needed purpose. That morning, David made a decision. A silent decision. He would stop defending his dream. He would stop explaining himself. And he would stop looking for support from people who had no intention of giving it. From that point forward, his results would speak for him. The following weeks brought a noticeable change. Rachel continued making comments about his business. But David no longer reacted. When she laughed, he stayed calm. When she criticized him, he kept working. When she compared him to other men, he simply listened and moved on. At first, Rachel seemed confused by the change. She was used to seeing frustration. She was used to seeing disappointment. Instead, David appeared focused, almost detached. The truth was simple. His energy was no longer being wasted on arguments. Every hour he once spent defending himself was now spent building, researching, learning, growing, and slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The business started gaining momentum. A few new clients turned into several. Several turned into dozens. Revenue began increasing month after month. The growth wasn't explosive. It wasn't the kind of success that made headlines. But it was real. More importantly, it was sustainable. For the first time, David could see a future that looked bigger than survival. A future that looked like opportunity. Still, he kept everything private. Rachel never asked about the business anymore, and David never volunteered information. The distance between them continued to grow. Neither of them realized it yet, but they were moving in opposite directions. Rachel was becoming increasingly focused on status and appearances. David was becoming increasingly focused on building something meaningful. Then, one ordinary afternoon, an email landed in David's inbox. At first glance, it looked like just another business inquiry. But after reading the first few lines, he sat up straight. His pulse quickened. This wasn't an ordinary opportunity. This was something much bigger. Something that had the power to change the course of his life forever. And David was about to discover that success often arrives when nobody is paying attention. The house stayed quiet long after midnight. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about proving himself to Rachel. He was thinking about scale, about impact, about what was actually possible if he stopped playing small. The opportunity in front of him wasn't random. It came from a company he had quietly studied for years without telling anyone. He had always been curious about how it operated, why it struggled, and where it was bleeding money. Now that curiosity has turned into something real. A door had opened. And it wasn't waiting for permission. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face slowly. The numbers on the screen were heavy, but not discouraging. If anything, they were inviting. A challenge that required strategy, patience, and courage. Not the kind of courage that is loud. The kind that moves in silence. Outside the room, life continued as normal. Rachel had returned from her work dinner earlier and gone straight to bed without asking many questions. That distance between them had become routine, now two people sharing a house, but no longer sharing the same direction. David didn't feel the need to explain anything anymore. That shift alone had changed everything. He opened a fresh document and began breaking the opportunity down piece by piece. Revenue gaps, operational weaknesses, market position. Everything started forming into a structure in his mind. What others saw as a failing company, he saw as a rebuild waiting to happen. Hours passed without notice. At some point, the exhaustion faded into focus. He saved the file carefully, as if locking away something valuable. When Rachel finally woke up, she noticed him sitting quietly at the table with a cup of coffee, staring at his laptop. "You've been up all night again?" she asked, barely looking up from her phone. "Something like that," David replied calmly. She shrugged, uninterested, and walked past him. No questions, no curiosity. Just distance. But inside David, something had already shifted permanently. That day, while Rachel went about her usual routine, David made calls he had never made before. Conversations with advisors. Introductions to people he had only studied from afar. Every step felt unfamiliar but necessary. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was positioning. And with each move, the opportunity became clearer and bigger than he first realized. This wasn't just about buying into a struggling company. It was about stepping into a space where decisions carried weight, where silence could become power. By evening, another message arrived confirming that multiple investors were now competing for the same deal. The race had officially begun. David read it once, then twice, then closed his laptop slowly. There was no panic in him, only focus. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't trying to survive someone else's expectations. He was building something they hadn't even seen coming yet. The message confirming the growing competition for the deal stayed on David's screen longer than expected. But his reaction didn't match the tension in the situation. No rushing, no panic, just steady focus. While others were now openly fighting for the company, David moved in the opposite direction. Quiet, controlled, almost invisible. That was the advantage he had built over the past few weeks. Most people deal with noise, calls, pressure, public offers, and fast decisions. David entered differently. He entered through understanding. Every night after that, he worked deeper into the structure of the company. Not just the numbers, but the weaknesses behind the numbers. The parts others ignored because they were chasing speed. And slowly a clearer picture formed. This wasn't a dying company. It was a mismanaged one. That difference mattered. Because mismanagement could be fixed. Death in business could not. The more David studied it, the more confident he became. Not loud confidence. The quiet kind that builds under pressure. By the time he met with his private investment partner again, his decision was already made. "You're moving faster than most people would in your position," he said. David kept his tone calm. "Most people wait until they feel ready. I prefer to understand enough and then act." The partner studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. That was all the approval David needed. From there, the process moved quietly but steadily. Legal reviews, financial structuring, ownership mapping. Every step done behind closed doors where no one outside the circle could see it forming. Meanwhile, life at home stayed unchanged. David's world was becoming the opposite. Silent, but expanding. One evening, while Rachel was preparing for another corporate dinner, she glanced at him briefly. "You've been really focused lately," she said, almost casually. David didn't look up from his laptop. "Just finishing something I started." She nodded without interest and left it there. That was the difference now. She no longer asked, and he no longer explained. Weeks passed like that, until the day everything became official. The final confirmation arrived quietly in his inbox. No celebration banner, no dramatic announcement. Just a simple message confirming full control had been secured through the acquisition structure. David read it once, then sat still. Not because he was shocked, but because everything he had been building had finally crossed into reality. The company that others were still competing for publicly was now already under his control privately. And no one in his personal life knew. He didn't rush to tell Rachel he didn't feel the need to prove anything yet. Because he understood something simple. Ownership is powerful, but timing is what makes it unstoppable. And now, he was ready for the next step. The reveal was coming, not as an explosion, but as a moment she would never see coming. The city kept moving like nothing had changed. But David had. The confirmation of ownership still sat quietly in his system, hidden behind layers of legal structure and private agreements. On paper, nothing looked different to the outside world. In reality, everything had shifted. And the most important rule now was simple. Stay invisible. That morning, David followed his usual routine. Same wake-up time, same coffee, same quiet walk to his desk. Rachel was still asleep when he started working. No celebration, no emotional reaction, just focus. He opened the company dashboard again. The same systems he had studied for months now responded differently. Not because they had changed, but because his position within them had. He wasn't looking at data as an outsider anymore. He was looking at it as someone who could eventually shape it. Still, he didn't move too fast. Because early power is fragile. One wrong step could expose everything before it was ready. At the company level, nothing was announced. Executives continued their meetings, managers continued their reports, teams continued their routines. From the outside, it looked like business as usual. But David noticed subtle shifts, small decisions being questioned more carefully, certain approvals slowing down. Change had already started spreading, just not publicly. That was enough for now. At home, Rachel moved through her day as she always did. Confident, busy, focused on her role, her image, her progress. She never asked what David was working on anymore. Not because she stopped caring, but because she had already categorized his business in her mind. Something small, something harmless, something temporary. That assumption gave David space he needed. That evening, Rachel came home later than usual, dropping her bag on the couch with a tired sigh. "The company's been acting strange," she said casually while loosening her heels. David looked up from his laptop. "In what way?" "It just changes everywhere. New instructions, different approvals. Even meetings feel controlled from somewhere else." She paused, then waved it off. "Probably new corporate structure stuff. Happens when companies shift leadership." David nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's usually what it means." The conversation ended there. But something inside David stayed alert. Not because she was close to discovering anything, but because she was already standing inside the system he now influenced without realizing it. That realization made everything feel sharper. Every interaction, every update, every silence. Over the next few days, David became even more deliberate. He didn't rush into decisions. He didn't announce presence. Instead, he observed how the organization reacted to invisible pressure. And what he saw confirmed everything he needed to know. People adapt quickly when they sense change, even if they don't understand it. By night, when the house was quiet again, David often sat alone thinking. Not about revenge, not about confrontation, but about timing. Because the truth was simple now. He didn't need to prove anything to Rachel. He just needed the right moment for truth to become unavoidable. And that moment was getting closer with every passing day. Rachel still believed she understood his world, but she was already living inside his influence. She just didn't know it yet. And David made sure it stayed that way. For now. The changes inside the company didn't slow down. If anything, they became more noticeable with each passing day. David could see it clearly now from his position inside the system. Small adjustments were turning into structural shifts. Teams were being reshuffled. Decision chains were tightening. Influence was being redirected without anyone openly saying it. And people like Rachel were starting to feel it the most. At first, she tried to ignore it. But something kept resisting her effort. It wasn't failure. It was friction. One morning, she entered a department review meeting expecting approval for a project she had been championing for weeks. She had already rehearsed her points. She was ready for a smooth sign-off. Instead, the room felt different. Quieter, more careful. The senior manager flipped through her report slowly, then leaned back. "This will need additional alignment before moving forward," he said. Rachel blinked. "It's already aligned with the previous feedback." "Yes," he replied, "but there's updated direction from above. We need to adjust accordingly." That phrase again, updated direction. Rachel felt her patience drop instantly. "There's always some new direction," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "Who is actually making these calls?" No one answered directly, just polite silence. The meeting moved on without her approval. And for the first time, Rachel left a room without getting what she wanted. That alone bothered her more than she expected. Later that day, she tried again with another proposal. Same result. Delayed, reviewed, rechecked, not rejected. Just controlled. It felt like something unseen was filtering everything she touched. By evening, her frustration followed her home. David was already at his desk when she walked in, loosening her heels and dropping her bag with more force than usual. "Something is definitely wrong at work," she said immediately. David looked up, calm as always. "What happened?" "They're slowing everything down. Every decision. Every approval. It's like someone is tightening control from the top and nobody wants to explain it." She paced slightly. "It's affecting everything I'm working on." David listened quietly. "That sounds like a restructuring phase," he said. Rachel stopped. "That's what they keep saying, too. But it feels bigger than that." She turned toward him. "Have you ever seen companies change like this before?" David paused just long enough to make it feel natural. "Yes," he said simply. "When leadership shifts, things usually feel unclear before they stabilize." Rachel exhaled, still unconvinced. "Well, whoever is doing it is either brilliant or reckless." David returned to his laptop. "Sometimes it's both." That answer lingered in the air longer than the conversation itself, because Rachel didn't realize she had just described the exact situation she was inside. A system changing from the top, quietly, carefully, and already affecting her directly. What she couldn't see yet was that she was no longer just dealing with internal company adjustments. She was now operating inside a structure that had already been reshaped by someone she underestimated completely. And that realization, when it came, would not arrive gently. The tension from the last meeting didn't fade. It followed Rachel into the next day like a shadow she couldn't shake. And the strange part was how everyone else seemed to be adjusting to it, except her. By the time the executive meeting was called, she was already mentally prepared for resistance. Still, nothing could fully prepare her for how controlled the room felt when she walked in. No casual conversations, no relaxed greetings. Just people sitting in their seats, waiting, like something important was about to be decided without anyone openly saying it. Rachel took her seat, placing her tablet carefully on the table. Across from her, senior executives reviewed documents in silence. Even the air felt heavier. The meeting began without delay. No warm-up, no updates, just structure. A new directive was introduced at the start, presented as a strategic realignment process. The wording was careful, but the message was clear. Things were changing. And not everyone had input anymore. Rachel's eyes stayed fixed as the discussion moved from department to department. Every proposal that came up was filtered through this new invisible standard. Approve, delay, rework, hold nothing moved freely anymore. When her name was finally called, she straightened her posture. This was her moment. She delivered her presentation with precision. Clean data, clear projections, strong execution plan. She had prepared for every possible objection. Or so she thought. When she finished, the room stayed quiet, not the normal kind of silence. This one felt measured. One of the senior executives finally spoke. "Your proposal is solid," he said, "but it doesn't fully align with the updated structure we're moving toward." Rachel didn't hesitate. "Then what exactly is the updated structure?" she asked. Her tone wasn't aggressive, just tired of not knowing. A few people shifted in their seats. The executive nodded slowly. "That will become clearer in the next phase." That answer again. Always coming later. Never now. Rachel leaned back slightly, frustration building under her calm expression. "So we're making decisions based on something no one can define yet?" The room went still. It wasn't rebellion, but it was close enough to make people uncomfortable. The executive met her gaze. "We are making adjustments based on leadership guidance," he said carefully. Rachel exhaled through her nose. And just like that, her proposal was placed under review again. No rejection. No approval. Just delay. As the meeting continued, Rachel barely focused. The pattern was too obvious now. Everything was being filtered through something unseen. Something she couldn't reach. When it finally ended, she left the room with slower steps than usual. In the hallway, she caught up with a colleague. "It's not just me, right?" she asked quietly. "Everything feels like it's being shaped by someone we don't see." Her colleague glanced around before replying. "There's definitely a shift happening," he said, "but no one knows who's driving it." Rachel frowned. That's the problem. By evening, she returned home drained. David was already at his desk, the glow of his laptop lighting his focused expression. Rachel paused at the doorway. "Today was the same again," she said. David looked up. "In what way?" "They keep delaying everything. It's like we're all reacting to instructions from someone invisible." She dropped her bag onto a chair. "And nobody can explain it." David listened quietly. Then he responded, steady and calm. "That usually means the structure is already in place. People just haven't fully adjusted yet." Rachel shook her head. "I just wish I knew who's behind it." A pause settled between them. A quiet one. Then David returned to his screen. Because she was asking the right question now. She just wasn't ready for the answer yet. And the next shift inside the company was already beginning to take shape. The room stayed frozen in that heavy silence after the announcement. Ownership transition. Those two words hung in the air like something no one fully wanted to accept yet. Rachel didn't move at first. Her eyes stayed locked on the front of the room, waiting for the explanation to become clearer, for someone to say it was just corporate wording, just another restructuring announcement. But nothing softened it. The executive continued, voice steady but serious. "This change has already been legally completed. Effective immediately, strategic control now rests with the new primary stakeholder." A low wave of murmurs spread across the room. Rachel finally blinked, her focus tightening. Legal, completed, already done. That meant there was no discussion left. Only confirmation. Her mind started running through possibilities, external investors, acquisition groups, private equity. Any name she could attach to what was happening. But nothing was shared yet. Just silence from the front. Then the executive added, "The new controlling party will now be integrated into executive oversight moving forward." That line changed the atmosphere again. This wasn't distant ownership. This was an inside influence. People shifted in their seats. Some exchanged uneasy looks. Others stayed completely still, trying to process what this meant for their roles, their decisions, their positions. Rachel felt it too. A pressure she couldn't explain. Not fear. Not yet, but something close to uncertainty. Then the doors at the side of the room opened. Slowly, deliberately, and David walked in. No announcement followed him, no introduction, just presence. He moved forward with calm steps, like he had been in that room many times before. Even though everything about the situation suggested otherwise. The room didn't react immediately. It took a moment for reality to catch up with sight. Rachel saw him first, and for a second, her expression didn't change at all. Her brain refused to connect what she was seeing with what she believed. Because the man walking toward the front of the room was the same man she had dismissed for years. The same man she had mocked at family gatherings. The same man she had spoken about like his efforts didn't matter. But here he was, in the center of a board-level executive meeting, where control over the entire company was being discussed. David stopped at the front. He didn't look around the room. Not immediately. His attention went straight to the documents placed on the table, then briefly to the executives waiting for confirmation. Everything about him was steady. Controlled, certain, then his eyes lifted. And for the first time, they met Rachel's directly. No shock, no anger, no satisfaction, just recognition. As if this moment had been accounted for long before it happened. Rachel's throat tightened slightly, though she didn't move. Around her, the room began to stir again, but it felt distant now. Muffled, unimportant, the executive stepped back slightly. "Please allow me to formally introduce," he said, "the new controlling stakeholder overseeing the transition process." David stepped forward just enough for the room to focus fully on him. And in that moment, every assumption Rachel had built about her husband, her marriage, and her understanding of his life began to break apart at the same time. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. because the truth she had been ignoring for years was now standing right in front of her, and there was no more space left for misunderstanding. The room stayed still even after David stepped forward. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the moment had already settled too deep for quick reactions. Rachel remained seated, her hands resting on the table, but her mind was no longer in the room. It was trying to connect two versions of reality that refused to match: the man she knew, and the man standing in front of her now. David finally turned slightly toward the executives, breaking the silence with a calm, steady voice. "Thank you for attending." His tone was simple, controlled, professional, but it carried authority that didn't need volume to be felt. Rachel felt her chest tighten again, not because he spoke, but because everyone in the room was listening differently now, like they were hearing him for the first time. David continued, "The transition has been completed. My role here is not disruption, but alignment." A few executives nodded slowly, still processing. Rachel's expression remained fixed, but something inside her was starting to crack open. Alignment. That was the word they had been using for weeks. Now it had a face. David, the senior executive, stepped forward slightly. "For clarity," he said, "this acquisition and restructuring process was finalized under a private agreement structure. Operational continuity was maintained to avoid internal disruption." A few people glanced at each other. Still no full clarity, but enough to understand the scale. Rachel finally raised her hand slightly. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "How long has this been planned?" The room shifted again. All eyes flicked toward David. He didn't look surprised by the question. In fact, he looked like he had already expected it. "A while," he said simply. That answer wasn't enough for her. It never would be. Rachel stood slowly now, no longer able to stay seated. "You've been involved in this company, and you never said anything?" Her voice was steady, but underneath it was disbelief. David met her eyes again. Not cold, not emotional, just steady. "There was no reason to announce it before completion," he replied. The words were calm, but they landed heavily. Rachel blinked. Her thoughts moved faster now. All the meetings, all the changes, all the delays she couldn't explain. Everything suddenly started forming a pattern she hadn't seen before. Her voice lowered slightly. "So all those changes, the restructuring, the approvals, that was you?" A silence followed, not because the answer wasn't known, but because everyone understood what it meant. David didn't rush his response. Yes, that single word changed the entire room. Rachel sat back down slowly, like her body had finally caught up with the shock her mind had already felt. The man she had dismissed, the man she had mocked, the man she believed was still trying, had been operating at a level she never even considered. Her voice came again, weaker now. "Why didn't you tell me?" That question hung in the air longer than the others. This time, David paused. Not for drama, but for clarity. Because it wasn't the right time. Rachel stared at him. Her breathing was slower now. Not calm, just controlled shock. Around them, the executives remained silent, watching a personal truth unfold inside a professional space. David continued, voice steady. "I didn't want interference. I needed the structure to complete first." Rachel looked down at the table for a moment, then back at him. Her mind was struggling to reconcile the man she had lived with and the man standing in front of her now. Years of assumptions collapsing at once. All the jokes, all the dismissals, all the moments she believed she was ahead of him. She swallowed slightly. "So all this time, I didn't know who you really were." David didn't respond immediately. Not because he was avoiding it, but because there was nothing left to add to that sentence. He simply said, "No, you didn't." The room stayed quiet again, but this silence was different. This one was final, because the truth was no longer hidden. It was standing in the open, and Rachel was finally seeing it for what it was. The moment the words settled in the room, everything changed. Not loudly, not with chaos, but with a quiet shift that everyone could feel at once. Rachel remained seated, but she no longer looked like the confident executive who had walked into the meeting earlier. Her posture had changed slightly. Her eyes stayed fixed on David, as if looking at him longer might somehow make the situation reverse itself. It didn't. David stayed at the front of the room, calm and still, not trying to dominate the space, not trying to prove anything. Just present. The truth had already done that for him. The senior executives began to shift in their seats again, processing what had just been confirmed. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked at Rachel briefly, then away again. No one wanted to speak first, because everyone understood the weight of what had just been revealed. Rachel finally broke the silence. Her voice was quieter now, less sharp than before. So everything I said, everything I believed, she paused, struggling to finish the sentence, was wrong? David didn't react emotionally. He answered simply, "You believed what you saw." That answer hit harder than any accusation could have. Rachel looked down at her hands for a moment. Years of memories started replaying in her mind, but they didn't feel the same anymore. The jokes, the dismissive comments, the moments she had compared him to others, the times she had assumed she was ahead, more successful, more important. All of it now felt different. Heavier, real, around them. The meeting slowly shifted back into structure, but no one was fully focused anymore. The real event had already happened. Rachel spoke again, softer. "How long have you been at this level without me knowing?" David finally stepped slightly away from the center of the room, his tone still controlled. "Long enough to build it properly." That wasn't a full answer, but it didn't need to be. Rachel nodded slightly, though it wasn't agreement. It was acceptance of something she couldn't undo. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about work, promotions, or status. She was thinking about time. All the years she had underestimated him. All the moments she had spoken without understanding. All the distance she had created without realizing it. The executive meeting slowly began to conclude, but no one rushed out. There was no energy left for normal closure. People gathered their documents quietly, exchanging brief glances but avoiding direct conversation. David remained for a few moments longer, reviewing final notes with the leadership team. His presence was steady, but no longer needed to be explained. He was now part of the structure, not outside it. Rachel stood slowly after a while, still processing everything. As she moved toward the exit, she hesitated briefly near David. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something. Something meaningful. Something that could rewind time. But nothing came. David noticed her hesitation, but didn't press it. Some moments don't need words to be understood. Rachel finally walked out of the room. Each step felt slower than the last, not because she was physically tired, but because everything she believed about her life was no longer stable. Outside the boardroom, the world continued as normal. People walked. Phones rang. Conversations resumed. But for Rachel, nothing felt normal anymore. She had spent years believing she was ahead. Now she realized she had been standing in a place she never fully understood, and the consequences of that realization were only beginning to settle in. Inside the room, David remained briefly with the executives. Business continued. Decisions still had to be made, but the tone had changed permanently. What was once hidden had now become reality, and what happened next would determine how both their lives would move forward from here. Because truth had finally entered the room, and it was not leaving quietly. Everything Rachel believed about success, control, and confidence had been built on a version of reality that no longer existed. And now it was collapsing in real time. The boardroom meeting had ended, but the impact stayed behind like a heavy silence that followed her out into the hallway. Her steps felt slower as she walked through the building she had once moved through with pride. People noticed her, but no one spoke. That alone told her everything she needed to know. The balance had shifted. Not in theory. In reality. Inside the executive floor, David remained with the leadership team for final discussions. His presence was steady, calm, and fully integrated into the structure now. No longer introduced. No longer explained. Just accepted. Decisions moved forward around him naturally, as if he had always belonged there. Because now, he did. Rachel stood near the elevator for a long moment, staring at the floor numbers changing without really seeing them. Her mind kept replaying everything. Every comment she made, every laugh she used to dismiss him, every moment she thought she was ahead while he was still trying. But the truth had rewritten all of it. When she finally reached the ground floor, the noise of the outside world felt distant. Cars moved. People talked. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But her world had. That evening, she returned home earlier than usual. The house felt different now. Quieter, heavier, like it was holding the weight of everything that had been revealed. David was in his office again. The same place where years of quiet effort had built into something she never saw coming. Rachel stood at the door for a moment before speaking. "I didn't know," she said softly. David didn't look surprised. "I know." That answer wasn't cold, it was final. She stepped inside slowly. "All this time, I thought I understood everything," she said. David leaned back slightly in his chair. "You understood what was visible." Rachel nodded, but it didn't ease anything. For the first time, she wasn't trying to argue, not trying to defend herself, not trying to protect her image. That part of her felt too small now. "I was wrong," she said quietly. The room stayed still for a moment. David looked at her, not with anger, but not with comfort either, just clarity. "Everyone is wrong at some point," he said. That didn't remove the weight of her words, but it gave them truth without cruelty. Rachel looked down. "I didn't see your effort," she admitted. "I didn't see what you were building." David stayed silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "Most people don't see what's being built until it's already complete." That sentence stayed between them. Not as blame, but as reality. Rachel slowly exhaled, like something inside her had finally stopped resisting the truth. Outside, night had fully settled over the city. Inside the house, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no breaking point, no reversal. Just understanding settling in where ignorance used to be. Rachel finally spoke again. "What happens now?" David paused, looking at her for a moment longer than before. Then, he answered honestly. "Now, things move forward, not toward revenge, not toward punishment, but toward consequence, and also direction. Because what had been revealed wasn't the end of their story. It was the moment everything stopped being hidden and started becoming real." Rachel stood there quietly, accepting for the first time that some lessons don't arrive to destroy people. They arrive to show them what they failed to see. And sometimes that is the hardest lesson of all. The house stayed quiet. But the silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like the truth was finally settling in. And in that truth, both of them understood something unspoken. Nothing would ever be the same again.